He whispered a name like a forbidden password, and the airport stopped breathing. What happened next shocked everyone and set off a chain of events no one saw coming. Stay with me. This is a story you need to hear. Before we start the story, comment below and let us know where in the world you're watching from today. And if you find this story impactful, don't forget to subscribe for more. The airport at midnight felt like a city that had learned to breathe quietly. Fluorescent lights buzzed above gate, numbers like tired constellations. Rain thudded on the glass facade, little percussion that made the concourse smell of wet concrete and strong coffee. People moved through the hall with the slow, careful economy of those who carried too much small sorrow, rolling suitcases humming soft, low complaints, a child's shoe abandoned for 5 minutes and then found again, the practiced, polite distance of strangers. Announcements came and went, flat as weather reports, and the sound swallowed into the wide, empty spaces. Clint sat on a bench near gate B14, his coat folded over his knees as if the fabric might stop the world from touching him. He had the look of a man who had learned how to make haste a kind of quiet, not rushing, but always ready to move on. His hair was shorter now than it had been 10 years ago, the lines at his eyes deeper, the small scars someone earns from a life that keeps asking for a bit more. He watched the arrival board the way an old seafarer watches tide tables, knowing what the lights meant without needing to read the letters. In his inner coat pocket was a scrap of paper folded into a small, stubborn square. He had found it that morning when he packed. No envelope, no signature, just one word written in a hand that trembled more from hope than from ink. He kept pressing the paper between his fingers, feeling the thinness of it like the memory of someone's voice. Sometimes he would open his palm and say the word out loud, not as a prayer, but as a test. The word tasted like the first bite of a fruit you feared had rotted. Bright, dangerous, necessary. He did not want to think what would happen if the word proved true. He wore a well-cut suit that had seen better days. It fit him like a memory fits a photograph, not quite as it had been, but close enough to hold shape. His hands were steady as he checked his seat number, as if the simple mechanical certainty of a letter and a digit could anchor him against other, more complicated uncertainties. A small silver pen clip caught the light with a familiar blink. For a long time, gestures had kept him safe, the way he folded his napkin, the way he straightened a picture frame, the way he kept his chin level. Those gestures carried the weight of a life that refused to be soft. People passed, and some glanced his way. A couple arguing quietly about their son's homework, an older woman knitting a stubborn rectangle, a teen with earbuds lost inside the map of a new song. None of them saw the small tremor in Clint's thumb as he smoothed the scrap of paper. None of them could know that tonight he was carrying the last ledger of his choices. To them, he was simply a man in a suit waiting for a late flight. To him, every step down the jet bridge felt like a step toward a ledger page being turned. Once, he had moved through life as if the world owed him clarity. Now, clarity owed him something. He had come here with a fragile plan, a meeting, a person to see, a bridge to cross. The name on his flight confirmation was simple. It felt like a dare. He had rehearsed 1,000 versions of the conversation he would have on the other side. Apologies arranged in neat piles, explanations folded like origami, the small, clean lies that make forgiveness possible. But rehearsals are made of air, and air dissipates when faced with the weight of real breath. The terminal hummed with polite inconveniences. A child laughed somewhere ahead, a laugh like a bright coin dropped into a jar of dull glass. The vending machines blinked their promises of late-night snacks. A janitor moved his cart with the slow efficiency of someone who has seen the arc of many nights and knows that this, too, is a task worth doing. Clint watched the janitor for a moment and thought of routine as the only reliable prayer, the small actions that keep cities from collapsing into anarchy. Then, the thought surprised him with its tenderness. He had been given fewer chances to be tender lately, and he felt the hunger of that deficit. He thought, too, of the photograph tucked in his wallet, a woman with an easy smile, a man with a cautious one, a child with hair the color of late summer wheat. The picture had been taken in a backyard that smelled of cut grass and light. He kept it folded on the inside because the world outside often asked for harder faces. He had promised himself, on nights when the house was a hollow, that he would make things right. That promise had the stubborn, foolish insistence of an old friend. Sometimes promises are all one owns. Beside him, a screen announced a delay. Gate B14, departure pending. A cluster of travelers groaned. Others used the pause to pull out phones and reconnect with absent histories. Clint took the scrap of paper from his pocket and read the single word again, letting its letters slide under his tongue. It was not a command, it was an invitation. He closed his eyes and for a moment let the airport dissolve into a single breathing organism, people exhaling in waves, the building inhaling the sounds. He was not a man who had meant to be small. Life had made him small in parts, yes, but those parts had edges that cut and depths that surprised. He had taught himself to find dignity in small things, picking a coffee without asking for sugar, holding the door for someone laden with bags, saying thank you like a promise. Those small dignities made up the scaffolding of who he was. Now that scaffold felt shaky, and he was aware of the thinness of it. Someone dropped a magazine. Pages fluttered, a small bird made of paper. A woman in a red coat crossed the concourse with a determined look and a child pulling at her sleeve. A voice over the speakers gave a name that was not his. The world, in its ordinary way, continued to unfurl. Clint kept the scrap against his palm and felt the warmth of his own skin answering it. He folded the paper back into its small square and slid home. There was a flight to catch, a conversation to have, and a single word to answer. The screen above gate B14 flashed like a distant lighthouse, delayed, new boarding time 1:40. Rain kept its steady percussion on the glass. Clint folded the scrap of paper again and tucked it deeper, the thin square now a warm coin against his palm. He stood when the woman at the counter looked up, as if there were an unspoken rule about standing when someone moves your future from one column to another. The woman behind the desk was young, maybe 28, with hair pulled into a precise knot and a name tag that read Rachel. Her smile was worn smooth by courtesy. Her eyes were the careful sort that glanced and measured. She took Clint's boarding pass and passport like a ritual, an exchange that ought to settle things. The scanner clicked. Her fingers danced over the keyboard. She read the name aloud with the flat, small voice of someone used to repeating facts. Clint Eastwood, she said, then paused, the pause a small, sharp thing. Her screen chimed softly. She frowned, looked up at him, and then back at the monitor. The frown became a careful line. Around her, other faces moved like background actors in a play the staff had performed 1,000 times. Clint felt the world narrow to the counter, the hum of the vending machines, the fluorescent buzz in the ceiling. There's a problem, Rachel said. Her voice had no accusation in it, only the mechanical cool of procedure. She tapped again. Her screen showed a line in a different column. Alert, verify, ID. The words were small but loud in the quiet. Clint smiled, the sort of smile that tried to be reasonable. There must be a mistake, he said. My name is right here. He handed over his passport, the lamplight catching the crease by his thumb. The passport photo looked like him, and yet not at all. Time makes photographs lie in small ways. Rachel compared it to his face like someone checking a map against a shoreline that had shifted. A man came then, the kind of man airports appoint to be seen. He had a jacket too clean to be honest and a badge that read marked security. He moved like someone who carried authority, like a coat. It fit him and gave him shape. He asked a few questions in a voice practice to be practical. Clint answered. He kept his words even measured. He did not shout. He did not plead. He only explained, and explanations have a way of sounding like confessions when an audience expects a crime. Mark's jaw tightened. He looked at Rachel and then at a small screen in the corner of the counter where a log scrolled in letters that suggested bureaucracy and something more dangerous, a list that was not meant for casual eyes. He frowned, thumbed his ear as if listening to a private channel. Clint noticed this, noticed the micro-movements of a machine caged in a man. You'll need to step aside, Mark said. His words had the flatness of someone trained to move things through friction. "We'll verify your identity." Clint had spent years in a culture where being asked to step aside often meant being separated from dignity. He felt the quiet of the terminal press on his chest. People watched with a dilution of curiosity, some with pity, more with the impatience of lives that wait for their own dramas. He put his passport back in his hand and folded his fingers over it like a small shield. "Is this because of the delay?" he asked, trying to keep an ordinary thread in the conversation. "I can wait. I can—" "It's not the delay," Rachel said, and the words cut through the soft, and for a moment her face showed something that was not policy, a flicker of worry that seemed born of private knowledge. She looked away quickly, as if she had betrayed herself. "There's an internal note," she said, voice small. "Hold on." Her hand trembled, for the first time a real human tremor, not the mechanical calm of the terminal. Clint watched the tremor like a tide change. He felt the old lines rewrite themselves inside him. He had been pushed aside before. People had closed doors, folded their hands, and told him they had no space. He had learned how to breathe in those silences. Mark nodded to someone beyond the gate, and two uniformed officers approached with the slow sympathy of people who had rehearsed help until the rehearsal became real. They were polite, their badges were clean. One of them gestured toward the empty end of the concourse as if gently directing a lost dog. Clint stood. His feet wanted to be a small rebellion. He folded the scrap of paper, then stopped. The paper slipped from between his fingers and fluttered to the floor like a white moth. Rachel made a small noise and bent to pick it up faster than seemed necessary. Her fingers brushed the fold, and for an instant her eyes widened. The scrap opened between her palms, and the word printed there was simple and ordinary and larger than anything the airport could swallow: Grace. For a second, the name sat in the air in the way rain sits on skin, impossible to ignore and impossible to ignore. Clint moved toward Rachel. He began, but Mark's hand was on his elbow, firm but not cruel. The officers moved closer, a choreography of control. Rachel's face had gone white. She looked at the word at Clint, then at the closed gate, beyond which travelers rehearsed their own exits and entrances. The tremor in her hand grew, as if the scrap had handed something back she was not prepared to hold. Her mouth parted, and she made a noise that was half apology and half fear. "You have to leave the gate area," Mark said. His voice tried to be neutral and failed because he was too close to something he didn't understand. He said it like a man reciting a line. The people nearby turned their faces in small, polite circles to watch. A child pointed and tugged his mother's sleeve. The janitor paused, his mop suspended mid-stroke, like a tiny, inconsequential halo. The vending machines blinked their promises. The terminal hummed with 1,000 small indifferences. Clint steadied himself. He did not struggle. He did not shout. He folded his lottery of patience and let it be carried away by the officers. But as he was guided past the gate, he spoke the name the scrap had shown them. He said it plainly, without theatrics, the word leaving him like a small, inevitable truth. "Grace," he said. Their eyes, Rachel's, Mark's, the officers, fixed on him as if the world had just revealed a seam. The name hovered between them, an accusation and a key. The rain sounded harder against the glass. Somewhere, a plane announced a new time for the night. The moment stretched and then settled into a quieter tension, like the air before a thunderclap. They led him away from the gate into a small office that smelled of lemon cleaner and old paperbacks. The room had one window that looked out onto the concourse and a table the color of tired wood. Mark closed the door behind them with the care of a man who did not want whatever happened inside to leak out into the thin civility of the terminal. An officer named Daniel sat across from Clint, arms folded, badge catching the light like a reminder. "Sir, we just need to ask you a few questions," Mark said. He tried to be polite. The words landed like somebody throwing down a mat and asking someone to sit. Clint nodded and sat. He folded his hands the way people fold hands when they want to look harmless. "I don't have anything to hide," he said. The voice was quiet but steady. It held the small, hard place where courage lives when a man has decided to be honest. Mark glanced at the notebook on the table at the printed line that had brought them together. Alert, verify, ID flagged. There's a note in the system, he said, from an external source. Says you should be flagged for an interview. Name match, possible security watch. Clint watched Mark's mouth as he spoke, the way a man reads weather in someone else's face. I've been through interviews before, Clint said. Sometimes they're simple. Sometimes they're not. Whatever this is, tell me straight. Daniel shifted. There was a corporate thing back in the day, he said. We don't put names on lists for no reason. There was an investigation. It comes back to a certain, he stopped, choosing words like weapons. Clint closed his eyes for a moment. The past had been a weight. He carried like a folded blanket, soft when you remembered warmth, heavy when you had to carry it. A long time ago, he said, I was involved in things that hurt people. I know that. He kept his voice small, not to beg, but because truth is lighter when it is quiet. I'm here to see someone, to make it right. If that's part of it, then let it be. But don't make my last hour into a trial. Mark studied him. There was something in Mark's face that betrayed him, a man who had been taught to trust orders, yet who was also old enough to know that orders are sometimes given by people who never feel the consequence. Mark's father had lost a job after a company closure 10 years ago. He told himself it was not Clint's fault, but the memory made him notice the direction Clint carried himself, careful, not arrogant, not defensive. Outside the door, Rachel stood behind the counter with her hands folded, watching the small square of floor that separated them from the world. She felt as if she had been accidentally let in on an old secret. The scrap of paper had been simple, one word, but something about the handwriting had pinned him off to her memory. She had once found a note in a nonprofit's receipt book, a small endorsement signed the same way. The name Grace had been part of a campaign she had worked on years earlier. That campaign had promised shelter and help, and then it had been wound down. People had been moved, their donations lost in tall accounts. Rachel had watched volunteers leave with their hands empty. Seeing the name on Clint's paper had opened a fissure in her that she didn't expect. She had felt both the quickening of recognition and a slow drop of betrayal, because recognition meant connection and connection meant responsibility. She had raised her hand to her mouth, and for a breath, she feared she had been part of something she could not undo. A quiet hawk of guilt hovered in Rachel's chest. She had started at the airport to leave behind a life of small, broken promises. Her mother had taught her to be practical. Her training had taught her to follow procedure. Yet when Mark left the office and glanced at her, something passed between them, an unspoken assessment, and she remembered the message that had pinged on her phone an hour earlier. Hold, Clint Eastwood, do not board. The text had come from an unknown number, but with a name she knew, Evelyn. Evelyn was the airport manager, and Evelyn's messages were never casual. Rachel had hesitated before forwarding the alert into the system. She hesitated now, because the hesitation was where guilt had its home. Inside the office, Clint spoke of small things, of a photograph folded in his wallet, a child who once called him steady, a promise that had come loose when he had chosen speed over care. He did not ask for mercy. He only let the truth breathe. He said the name he had been carrying was like a coin. I'm meeting Grace, he said. She sent me the note. She asked me to come. Mark's eyes narrowed for a second, then softened. Grace, he repeated. The name was ordinary, but the way it sat in the room felt loaded. For Clint, it was a door. For Mark, it was a test. For Rachel, it was a memory that might be awound. Why now? Daniel asked. He wanted timelines. He wanted cause and effect. He wanted the past to be a neat explanation. Clint looked at the two men and then out the small window at the moving people. Some things can't wait, he said. Some things you can put off, and they get louder. I'm not running from anything. I want to be part of the answer. The two officers exchanged a look that said the job was not simple and never had been. Mark left the room for a moment and then returned with a clipboard. The formalities were the choreography of an uncertain world. When the door opened, Rachel's hand brushed against the counter, and a scrap of paper felt like a pulse under her skin. She slid it into her palm and felt the texture of the fold as if she could feel the person who had written it. She thought of the volunteers who had packed boxes of blankets and left them in storage when programs closed. She thought of the donors who kept giving with clean hearts. She thought of the way promises sometimes turn into paperwork that hides truth. She carried that memory like a small stone and wondered if this man before her, this man who sighed like someone remembering how to be simple, was the stone's origin or the person who had tried to smooth it. Mark returned and said they would hold Clint for a short verification. The word hold felt like a thin rope. Clint allowed himself to be guided back past the gate, but he walked with a small dignity that refused to be swallowed. Rachel watched him go and thought of the note. She wanted to return it, to keep the word as a secret between two strangers, but her thumb found the crease and smoothed it out. She felt the pull of two loyalties, to procedure and to something softer that had nothing to do with badges. As the office door clicked shut behind him, each of them turned inward to a question they did not yet ask aloud. Who holds the right to decide when a man's past must define his present, and who holds the burden of the choice when the answer tilts toward shame? They left Clint sitting under the tired light, while Mark went to consult with someone on a phone that crackled through like an old radio. Rachel lingered near the counter, the scrap of paper folded tight in her palm. The room smelled of lemon cleaner and the faint burnt sugar of a coffee left too long. For a moment, everything held its breath, the cheap clock on the wall, the swivel of the office chair, the soft hum of the terminal beyond the glass. When Mark came back, he was not alone. A woman walked in behind him with the easy authority of someone who expected the world to make room. She wore a navy blazer and a name pin that read Evelyn Hart. Up close, her face carried the soft, practiced lines of someone used to giving orders and keeping secrets. Her eyes watched Clint like someone reading a page for a second meaning. Clint felt something strange and cold move through him. He had expected many things when he had taken the plane, but not this. Not that the person who had sent the message that brought him here would come in person. He studied Evelyn's hands the way a man looks for a trait that would make someone trustworthy. Her fingers were steady as a metronome. "Mr. Eastwood," Evelyn said, and her voice was smooth, almost familiar. "I'm the airport manager. I called this in myself." For a second, there was only the quiet, like a room where a clock had stopped. Rachel's grip on the paper tightened. Mark's jaw had a small mechanical hitch, the kind of movement that shows when a man's beliefs are nudged. "You called it in?" Clint echoed. He kept his voice level, but there was a brittle edge now. "You're the one who sent the hold?" Evelyn stepped closer and folded her hands. "Yes, there were questions about you. I thought it best to have you verified before boarding." Her smile had the small cruelty of someone who knows the exact tilt of a scale. Clint's memory reached back in a flood. The scrap in Rachel's hand, the handwriting that had opened a long-closed drawer in Rachel's mind. The name Grace. He thought of a backyard, a photograph, a promise. He thought, too, of nights when he had held his son and whispered apologies into the dark. "Why?" he said simply. "If you wrote me a note, why trap me now?" Evelyn's eyes flicked to Rachel and then away. For a beat, she seemed to measure whether to tell the truth as if truth could be weighed like coins. Then she said, quieter, "Because the note was not for me in kindness. It was for me in need. But people hear what they want to hear. I needed you to come." Clint felt the room shrink. Needed me to come for what? Evelyn's hand moved to a folder as if the motion alone could tell the story. She tapped it closed, then opened it again to reveal a stack of printouts. Photographs, balance sheets, lists. She slid one across the table. It was a picture from years ago, volunteers packing boxes in a small warehouse, a banner in the background reading Grace Foundation. In the center of the photo, younger faces smiled for the camera. In the safety of that old snapshot, a woman with a fierce, tired smile, she might have been called Grace, stood next to a man Clint recognized faintly, a version of himself before time had rearranged him. "You remember this?" Evelyn asked. Her voice had no accusation, only a thin patience. "You were on the board. You signed off on the accounts." Clint looked at the papers as if the ink might change its story. He remembered the campaign. He remembered donors with trusting eyes and volunteers who believed the promises they were given. He remembered the weight of the ledger when problems started and how quickly explanations turned into excuses. He had thought he'd been trying to fix it then. He had thought he'd done the hard thing. Evelyn's mouth hardened. When funds were moved, people lost shelter. Families were turned away. The campaign folded, and people who needed help were left with nothing. After that, the organization changed hands. People went quiet. You disappeared for a while. Then you wrote to someone using the name Grace. The name landed like a stone. Clint felt the memory slide, the edges sharp. I did right. I wanted to make it right. I wanted to find her. And you found a name, Evelyn said. Or you thought you did. She paused, and her face shifted in a way that made Clint uneasy. The note you carried? It was in a hand I recognized. I have kept that handwriting in files for years. It is the same hand that signed receipts when the foundation closed accounts. I kept those receipts because someone had to. I began to look into people associated with the collapse. I kept notes. I followed the leads. Rachel's throat made a small sound. She remembered a night in the food bank, the same handwriting in a receipt book, the hush that followed when donations were redirected and no one explained where things went. Now she saw the paper folded in her palm as an accusation, as much as a plea. Evelyn continued, the air growing colder with each sentence. When I saw your name on the manifest, I checked the system. I flagged you. Not because I wanted to humiliate you publicly, Mr. Eastwood. I flagged you because I wanted answers. I wanted to know if the man who had been part of the collapse would stand and say why. I wanted to know if he would face the people he had hurt. There was a small, hard triumph to her words. It was not relief for the lost, it was a reckoning. Clint felt the shape of betrayal unfold like a map he had never wanted to read. He had come to see Grace, to make amends, to ask for forgiveness. Instead, he had walked into a net woven by someone who had lost everything in the aftermath of his decisions. You used me, he said. It was not a question. You used my hope to trap me. Evelyn's lips thinned. I used whatever I had to get answers. She looked at Mark, then at Daniel, as if to remind them that the law would be the instrument for whatever followed. You will have your verification. You will have your questions. And you will have a chance to explain. As she spoke, Clint felt something colder than shame, a hollowing that came from the slow understanding that the person he had come to find, the name he had guarded like a prayer, might have been the very hand that struck the lock on his chance to set things right. Rachel watched him and felt the old, familiar guilt in her chest, the small, heavy kind that grows when you fold a lie into your daily work. Outside, through the thin window, the concourse moved on, travelers passing like a film where nothing had changed. Inside, the room seemed smaller. Clint folded his hands and thought of the photograph in his wallet, the promise he had made. The betrayal had been more than a deception, it had rewritten the map by which he had planned to walk. Now, every step forward felt uncertain and watched. They sat in the small office like people trapped in a slow elevator, the world above moving with the unbothered speed of ordinary lives. The lemon smell wavered. Outside, the terminal's noise softened into a steady pulse. Inside, the conversation tightened like a wire. You can stay here while we run your verification, Mark said, folding the clipboard in a way that made it look heavier than it was. He tried to sound neutral and kept missing by a fraction. Daniel tapped a tablet, as if that would make facts fall into place. Evelyn watched with the patient look of someone who had already written the ending in her head. Clint's hands were folded in his lap. The scrap of paper had been returned to Rachel, who kept it wrapped in her palm like a conscience. He felt the paper's presence as if it were a second heart. He had expected questions, maybe suspicion, perhaps a delay. He had not expected an interrogation that smelled faintly of triumph. What exactly are you looking for? Clint asked. He did not want to give them a confession they could use like a mirror. He wanted to be honest, but he also wanted to protect the glimmer of what he had come to find. Records, Daniel said. Clarification. Explanation. His voice was plain. We have to be thorough. There could be a hold for hours, Mark added. Could be longer. We may need to contact external agencies. The words hung like winter fog. For the first time, the possibility of escalation, paperwork leading to police, phone calls leading to official records felt like an animal pacing near the door. Clint thought of the photograph in his wallet again, a backyard, and a promise. He thought of the child with sunlit hair who had once called him steady. He remembered, suddenly sharply, the sound of a missed call icon on his phone. He reached for the device. His hands moved with that small cramp of sudden urgency. A voicemail flashed on the screen from a number labeled Luke. His heart squeezed. He pressed play. The message was short and raw. "Dad, where are you? Mom says you left. Call me back. We need to talk." The rest was a breath of emotion, a sound that broke like a small wave. The line cut. Luke's voice still hovered in the room like a small, accusing tide. Clint's throat closed. He had not meant to be absent again. He had not meant to leave this conversation with his son unfinished. "Everything okay?" Mark asked, watching the color move across Clint's face. "Family," Clint said. The word felt both small and enormous. He wanted to call back, to hear more, to steady a voice he had sometimes neglected. But the officer's presence was a salt on the wound. Every minute here could become a larger piece of a past he was trying to set right. Rachel watched him from the counter, and her hands trembled behind the paper. She had sent a message to Evelyn earlier, the hold alert, because it had felt like the right call at the moment. Now she wondered if the right call had the same shape once consequences revealed themselves. She imagined Luke's voice and felt a prickle of kinship with Clint's fear. That prickle then twisted into something sharper, guilt. She had been part of the chain that led to this moment. Was she now an accessory to his undoing? "Is there anyone we should call?" Daniel asked Clint. It was protocol. It was also a test. Names can be things that unlock mercy or lock doors. Clint hesitated. If he gave a contact, it might alarm someone else. If he withheld it, it might look evasive. He thought of Grace, of the scrap, of the hope that had pushed him onto the plane. To call someone now felt like a betrayal of that hope. To remain silent felt like an abandonment. The choices stacked and pressed like the weight of a lid. "I'd rather not involve my family in this," he said finally. "Not yet." Mark's jaw tightened. "If this goes beyond a simple verification," he said, "it could trigger a formal hold. That means transport, possible custody depending on what comes back. You understand?" Clint did. He understood the legal shapes of consequences. He also understood the human shapes. A son waiting for a call, a woman who might be waiting for a truth, an organization that had been hollowed out by missing promises. The ledger in his life had corners he had not flattened. The decision now was a hinge. He had a folder in his carry bag, thin, creased, that he had not shown to anyone. Years ago, he had kept notes, letters, evidence of attempts to trace where funds had gone, names he had written down after nights of thinking and phone calls he'd made when sleepless. He had kept proof that he had tried to fix things, that he had not simply walked away. The folder could be a key or a trap. It could show his effort to make amends, or it could reveal his fingerprints on mistakes that had damaged lives. Mark noticed the way Clint's hand hovered over his bag. "If you have documents that explain your presence here," Mark said, "now would be the time to show them. It'll help speed things." A simpler man would have opened the bag, but the simpler path was never Clint's. Opening it meant opening old wounds in public, and public wounds often hemorrhaged until nothing stayed intact. He imagined the ledger on the table, officials peering at ink like vultures. He imagined Evelyn watching with that small, satisfied triumph at having summoned the man whose actions had helped unravel things. He also imagined Grace, whoever she was, waiting somewhere beyond the airport's noise. What would she think if he was taken away now, cuffed by bureaucracy, before he could speak? Would she recognize the difference between a man punished for past mistakes and a man seeking to repair them? Rachel moved slightly, as if the scrap in her hand might point away. Mark's eyes flicked between the players, weighing law and compassion. Daniel drummed his fingers with the impatience of someone who wanted a clean answer. Clint exhaled and unfastened the zipper of his bag. The sound was small, the motion decisive. He lifted the folder out and set it on the table like an offering. Paper slid under the office light, each page a small, stubborn testimony. The room leaned forward, listening. "Open it," Evelyn said, her voice soft but not kind. "Let's see." Clint's fingers found a letter at the top. He could read it now and hand them proof that he had tried, or he could keep it hidden and hope the world would allow him to pass. The choice he made in the next breath would shape everything that followed. Custody or conversation, exposure or mercy, a bridge built or a bridge burned. They had all leaned in when Clint set the folder on the table. Under the thin office light, paper looked like bone, fragile and honest. He put one photograph down, then another, then a stack of typed letters with headers and timestamps. The room smelled of lemon cleaner and the metallic promise of rain. Outside, a plane engine purred like a sleeping beast. "This is from 3 years ago," Clint said, voice low but steady. "Emails, bank notices, copies of receipts. I kept everything I could find. I started calling people. I recorded one call." His thumb fumbled at the recorder he kept in a pocket for nights like this, and then pressed play. Evelyn's voice filled the small room, crisp and careful on the recorded line. "We'll classify that payment under operational expenses," the voice said. "Nobody needs to know the full details. People will be grateful the program continued." The sentence carried a soft cruelty, the casual language of someone who had learned to hide sharp things in polite speech. Mark's face lost color. Daniel's fingers drummed, stopped, then stilled. Evelyn's smile hardened until it looked like a blade. "That's a forgery," she snapped before the playback finished, an automatic defense that had the waste of a practiced liar. "It's not," Clint said. "I have bank receipts that match dates and copies of invoices that went to a shell company. Look here." He tapped a ledger page. The handwriting matched the script on the scrap of paper, the same curl and pressure Rachel had seen before. "I thought I could find Grace and make it right. I thought she had written this to say it was safe to come. Instead, it seems she wrote to lure me." Rachel's body seemed to shift as if listening to something inside herself. For the first time since the night began, she stepped forward. "I recognized the hand because I saw it on the receipts at the old community center," she said, voice small but clear. "I kept a photograph of one of those receipts when I left. I didn't know what I would do with it, but I kept it." She reached into her pocket and handed over a crumpled image. The room breathed in that small movement. Mark looked at the photograph and then at the ledger. Something in his posture changed. He had been walking the line between the comfort of procedure and the discomfort of truth, and now the line snapped. "Evelyn," he said slowly, "these are on file. If what he's showing matches, then we have a very different problem." Evelyn moved as if to reach for the documents, then stopped. Her hands trembled, not with fear, but with the precise panic of someone who has been good at making decisions without witnesses. "You don't understand," she said. "We were trying to keep programs running. If funds were reallocated," it was her defense fell like paper in a draft. The recorded voice kept playing, and with each repetition the facade cracked. Beyond the small office window, people began to crowd near the gate like a living jury. A child's laugh made it impossible to forget that life went on. Someone had been recording on their phone. In the hum of fluorescent light, the recorded words were heavy with evidence. Even Evelyn's closest supporters in the room, her badge, her blazer, the small power she had exercised quietly, lost their sheen. There's a new sound then. The click of a phone unlock, a voice on a line. Clint's phone vibrated in his hand. He glanced down. It was a video message he had not expected to receive. One from a woman named Grace, recorded seconds earlier and sent when his flight manifest had shown him delayed. Her face filled the small screen. An older woman, cheeks lined, eyes that had not learned to turn away. She spoke with an evenness that made the words land like stones. "Clint," she said, "I told you to come because I needed to see you. But I also needed witnesses. I have copies of receipts. I know what happened. Evelyn, why did you take from the children?" The room dropped into silence, so deep it was almost audible. Evelyn's mouth opened as if to answer, then closed. The evidence had multiplied into a net she could not step out of. Someone in the concourse shouted. The janitor had stopped his mop and now leaned against the vending machine, watching as if the scene were a small, dangerous film. Mark cursed softly, not in anger, but in the realization of consequence. He stood and moved to the door, and for a moment it felt like the whole airport watched that doorway like an altar. People clustered, phones up, faces lit by screens. News travels fast where public spectacle forms. Evelyn's shoulders slumped. The manager, who had once held orders like a shield, now seemed smaller. "We were trying to keep it going," she said at last, voice raw. "Donations were drying up. I thought reallocating would." Her words stopped under their own weight. There was no clean moral in what she had done, only a string of justifications that sounded thin in the buzzing air. "You thought you could play God with other people's needs," Grace said now, stepping into the doorway. Her voice did not tremble. There was grief in it, but beneath the grief, an authority that came from having watched suffering and refusing to let it be erased by politeness. "You counted on people to trust your titles. You used my name when it suited you. You hid receipts and turned the hungry away." A woman behind Grace, someone from the old volunteer network, had brought a folder of her own. She offered copies of canceled checks, names of families turned away, testimonies taped into pages. The crowd's murmurs turned into a chorus that demanded consequence. Mark moved toward Evelyn with his badge out, the ritual of law meeting the collapse of false power. Daniel called for backup. The scene had become not just a verification, but an exposure. Evelyn's authority had dissolved into an accounting scandal in the open. Clint felt something rip open inside him, the old, guilty ache of responsibility mixing strangely with a raw, simple relief. He had come to make amends. Now he watched as the truth he carried was no longer only his burden. The officers read Evelyn her rights. Her mouth moved, and the words were defensive and small. The facility of command had no way to repair what was clogged with greed. Outside in the concourse, a man he recognized from earlier, Luke, pushed through the crowd. He had been drawn by the tone of a voice he loved and feared. When he stepped into the office doorway and saw his father standing amid papers and people, his face went from confusion to grief, so public it made the air feel thin. "Dad," Luke breathed. He did not say it as an accusation, but as a tether. Clint's eyes found his son's, and something soft, battered, and true moved across his face. The plane's engine outside kept its low mechanical sigh. Rain had finally slowed to a hush. In the minutes that followed, people spoke in testimonies and statements. Evelyn was escorted away. The documents were cataloged. The volunteers and victims were given a place to file complaints. Clint watched it all, feeling small and huge at once. The relief of the truth aired, the ache of what had been taken, and the strange, lighted possibility of repair. Grace came to him then, not as an accuser, but as someone who had chosen a new beginning. She touched his hand like an old wound being covered with a clean bandage. "You came," she said simply. "I did," Clint answered. He looked at Luke, then at Rachel, then at the small square of paper that had started the whole night. He slid the scrap from his pocket and held it out between them. The word on it, Grace, was no longer only an invitation or a trap. It was a mirror of all the messy, human things that had happened here. Hope bent into betrayal, then unraveled into truth. Outside, the airport continued to breathe. People left, people stayed, planes came and went. Inside, under the tired light, Clint felt the quiet start of something he had not believed in for a long time. That telling the truth, however late, can sometimes be the first step toward making amends. For a long while after Evelyn was led away, the office smelled of wet paper and a tired kind of relief. People filed statements and gave names. Volunteers hugged one another with the awkwardness of people who had been wronged and suddenly found they could speak. The airport hummed. But it felt different now, like a place that had been scrubbed clean in one small corner of the world. Clint sat with Luke beside him on a low bench outside the office. His son's jacket still smelled faintly of rain. Luke's hands were folded in his lap, and he watched his father, like someone waiting for the last page of a book, to tell them what the whole story meant. Clint wanted to offer a tidy answer, a line that would fix the part of his life that felt like cracked glass. None came. Instead, he reached for the small photograph in his pocket, the one with the backyard and the laughing child, and turned it over slowly. "You did what you could," Luke said finally, voice careful. "You came. That matters." He didn't say it to absolve. He said it as a fact that could hold weight. Clint looked at his son and saw not the boy he had hurried past, but a man made for missed chances and stubborn love. Clint thought about the ledger he had laid on the table, receipts, emails, the one recorded voice that had toppled a story Evelyn had tried to keep neat. He had kept evidence because he had hated the idea of silence more than the idea of exposure. Still, he felt the old guilt like a bruise. He had been part of the decisions that let the organization collapse into a mess and had not always fought hard enough when lines should have been drawn. That truth settled on him harder than any accusation. Grace found him then, footsteps quiet on the tiled floor. Her face carried the same worn kindness he had seen in the video, but now it softened with something like purpose. She sat beside him and did not reach for the photograph. She watched Luke for a long moment, then looked at Clint. "You came on your own," she said. "That took courage. I wasn't sure you had left." "Courage or stubbornness," Clint answered. They both let themselves laugh, small and uneasy. "I wanted to try to fix things the right way." "We'll fix them the right way," she said. "But fixing means work. It means telling families the truth. It means returning money if we can trace it and rebuilding trust." Her voice was steady. "And it means you stay, if you'll let the work be more than penance." Clint felt the offer as both a weight and a hand. He had imagined a simple apology. He had not imagined repair, because repair is harder than regret. "If people want me," he said, "I'll do it. I don't want to disappear again." Rachel came up behind them with a paper cup of coffee for Clint and one for herself. Her face looked pale, but resolved. "I should have done more when I saw the receipts," she said, voice low. "I forwarded the alert because Evelyn's name was on it. I thought I was following rules. I didn't think about the man behind the name." She set the cup on Clint's knee and met his eyes. "If there's work to be done to make this right, I'll stay. I'll help connect volunteers, help track the donations that should still be out there." "I don't need you to forgive me," Clint said, "but I need help to do better." Outside the window, the rain had stopped and the concourse lit itself in the pale wash of sodium lamps. Mark came over and for a long moment did not speak. He looked older than he had that morning, like a man who had seen a management decision take on the shape of a life. "We'll have an inquiry," he said finally, "and the airport will have to answer to more than its procedures. I have to admit, if not for your documents, this might have been swept under. That will weigh on me." He paused, then added, "I'll make sure the families get a line of contact. I'll help where I can." Daniel, quieter than the others, tucked a crime report into a folder and nodded to Clint with the respect of someone who understands the small acts that become big changes. People who enforce rules sometimes feel small in the presence of truth. Tonight the rules had done work, and that fact comforted and unsettled them both. When the formalities wound down, Clint and Luke walked out into the early air. The sky was a soft, washed gray, and the airport parking lot smelled of warm asphalt. They moved slowly, allowing ordinary sounds to return. The distant rumble of a truck, the shuffle of a street sweeper, the call of a lone bird finding a perch. "I'm sorry I left," Clint said after a while, and he didn't try to dress the words up. They were simple and honest, and for once did not require defense. Luke's shoulders loosened a fraction. "You came back," he said. "We'll make new plans. Be here." It was a small, firm request that felt like the building of a bridge. Later, when the city light had sharpened into the kind of blue that means the night will give way, Clint sat alone in his rented car with a scrap of paper in his hand. He had been carrying it like a charm and a warning. Now it felt like something else, a promise that had been tested and found useful. He folded it slowly and tucked it into the inner pocket of his coat, not as a talisman, but as a reminder. He thought of the consequences. There would be inquiries, court dates, perhaps, families to meet, and records to untangle. There would be people who would not forgive him. There would be nights when the ledger of his life would keep him awake. But there would also be mornings of small work, filling forms, making calls, holding meetings with volunteers who still believed shelter mattered more than reputation. Small things that, over time, asked forgiveness to grow into something steady. He started the engine and felt the car hum beneath him. As he drove away, the airport lights blinked behind him like a city of small human stories. Clint did not know if it was redemption he'd earned or simply the first act of trying. Either way, he felt the heft of the choice to stay and work rather than to run. The road ahead was neither clean nor certain, but for the first time in a long time, it felt like a path he could walk. Share your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed the story, don't forget to like it, share it with your friends, and subscribe to the channel for more meaningful stories. Thank you for watching, and see you in the next video.